Hey YouTube, Ethan here. Today we're going to talk about how to transition your power network and oxygen not included from early game to mid game so you can set up your colony for success in the later stages of your playthrough. So first of all, I've done a few videos on power before, so go check them out if you need information on other areas regarding your power production. There's my Power 101 guide, an easy geothermal setup video, and power grids and smart batteries. These videos all focus on particular aspects of the game, but inevitably they'll all have some sort of overlapping information. In this video, I'm going to try to focus on tips that help you make the mid-game transition rather than specific builds that you can do. I think it's also important that I briefly go over what I mean by mid-game. I like to think of mid-game as the moment that you have access to renewable sources of water, such as a water geyser, a renewable source of power, such as a natural gas geyser, the beginning of steel production, the beginning of advanced cooling methods such as an aqua tuner, and of course, plastic production. Now, transitioning to mid-game doesn't necessarily mean having to have all of these things, but this is sort of the moment in your playthrough where your colony goes from barely surviving to thriving. Because once you get access to things like steel and plastic, and once you start building metal refineries and aqua tuners, it usually means that your colony can sustain itself to a degree. Now, one of the major differences of a colony transitioning from early game to mid game is going to be the insane spike in demand that your colony is going to have in power. For example, something like the metal refinery takes a whopping 1.2 kilowatts of power just to run. This means that it is impossible to run using the regular wires that you start out with for your base. So you're going to have to go with something like conductive wire or heavy watt wire. And this is the same for something like the aqua tuner. Again, 1.2 kilowatts of power. These are just insane requirements that you're not going to be able to provide for a very early colony. So I'm going to go over some tips on how I like to make the transition from early game to mid game. I'm going to be focused a lot on your power infrastructure setup and not so much the buildings that you can build in order to generate power from. Also keep in mind that this is not an exact blueprint of how your base should be set up with regards to your power infrastructure. With that in mind, feel free to leave your own tips in the comments below if I missed anything critical that you think that new players should know about. Okay, so let's take a look at our basic power configurations and oxygen not included. If you already feel proficient at setting up your wiring, feel free to skip to the next part where I discuss the tips for wiring within your colony. Otherwise, if you're a new player, stick around because this part is important. On the top here, I have two coal generators connected to a heavy watt wire, which is made out of unrefined metals, in this case, copper ore. The bottom wire is also made out of unrefined metals, and in this case, copper ore as well. The bottom configuration, we have the same two coal generators, but these two are going to be connected to heavy watt conductive wire, and this is made out of refined metals, in this case, gold, and the conductive wire, which is also made out of a refined metal. The difference between the regular heavy watt wire and the heavy watt conductive wire is that it's going to take you time to process these unrefined metals into refined metals in order to build the more advanced wiring. But they offer significant advantages. First of all, the heavy watt wire has a maximum limit of 20 kilowatts. Now, this is more than enough that you're going to need for your mid-game phase of your playthrough, depending on how fast you expand your colony. But you can usually stick to this for a very long time. The standard wire configuration, however, only has a limit of 1000 watts, and this is going to bottleneck your colony very early. And I'm going to get to this in just a moment when I go over the tips for wiring your base and transitioning to mid-game. The heavy watt conductive wire has over double the capacity of the heavy watt wire. We jump from 20 kilowatts to 50 kilowatts. This is a massive improvement, and it's going to support much of your colony even until you start building rockets, depending on how big your base is. The conductive wire has double the capacity of the standard wire, going from 1000 watts to 2000 watts. So let's take a look at the power configuration and how we're going to connect these. These two coal generators are connected to a smart battery. However, that's inconsequential for this purpose of the tutorial. It could be pretty much any battery because the power output from the coal generators is going to be the same regardless. The battery's only purpose is to store power, and in this case, since it's a smart battery, its purpose is to also turn on the coal generators when the smart battery becomes low on power, and you control those through high and low thresholds in the battery configuration screen. Each power generation method of your base is going to have power output. The power generation from the coal generators has 600 watts each. So when you add these together, these two coal generators are going to generate 1.2 kilowatts or 1200 watts of power. Let's take a look at a scenario at how we might connect these inside of our base. So very early on, it's likely that you're going to have regular wiring running throughout your base, and you're going to connect these to your coal generators, and you're going to be able to build very early buildings such as a couple oxygen diffusers, maybe a carbon skimmer, maybe a couple deodorizers, just things to get you started within your base. You can see once all these are connected, we now have a potential load of 375 watts, which is not too bad. We have a capacity of 1000 watts on this wiring. But as your base grows, you might have something like an electric grill, You might have a refrigerator. You may have a few liquid pumps. You may have a gas pump somewhere. And you may also be doing some filtering because it's going to be very hard to separate gases and liquids early on without this method. So let's connect all this and see what happens. Okay, so now we've just jumped our potential load to 1515 watts out of 1000 watts. And this is just not going to work if everything turns on at the exact same time. What's eventually going to happen is that these wires are going to experience overcurrent loading, and they're eventually going to break, and your duplicates will constantly have to repair them. So this is where something like the transformer comes in. The transformer is going to be very handy in this situation because it's going to allow you to limit how much power is being used by the network that is connected to the outlet of the transformer. So the regular transformer output is going to allow the limit to be up to 1000 watts and no more. But that also means that if all of these buildings try to run at the exact same time, something is not going to work because there's not enough power available on this network. This is despite the fact that the two cool generators are going to be generating 1.2 kilowatts of power. So there's something else that we can do in order to fix this. The other solution would be to have two power transformers, and we're going to run a feed from the power transformer we just installed out to the very far end of our network. And then we're going to sever the connection between the two networks because right now they're both connected to the same network just through two separate power transformers. So we're going to sever the connection, let's say here. So now we've just created two separate power networks using two transformers. The first one is going to have a potential load of 555 watts, and the second is going to have a potential load of 960 watts. These are both within the allowable range of your wiring network, so these wiring networks will not have any problems running whatsoever. But now we've just created another issue. The other issue being that these two networks still add up to be more than 1500 watts of power, and the coal generators are not going to be able to produce that because they only produce 600 watts each. So in order to get this working properly, we have to add another coal generator, and we have to connect that to the input of our transformers. Now we have a potential 1800 watts from our coal generators that can feed into the transformers, and the transformers will help protect the wires that are connected to it and not allow more than 1000 watts to pass through to the outputs below. But now we have another problem to deal with. Since these coal generators are going to be producing up to 1800 watts of power, that means that anything connected to this heavy watt wire that is not protected by transformers is going to be breaking due to overcurrent. So remember when we disconnected the wiring from our coal generators, we left one tile of regular wiring connected to our heavy watt wires. Even though this branch of wiring has technically nothing connected to it, this is still going to cause us a problem once this heavy watt wire is producing a load more than 1000 watts, because this wire has a potential load of 1515 watts, which is going to break when these coal generators are running at full capacity. So once you start building your network and oxygen not included, make sure that you delete any small wires that are originally attached to your main power network, otherwise you're going to have problems and your duplicates are going to waste resources repairing those issues throughout your entire playthrough, or until you go and delete that segment of wire. Okay, so now in the bottom scenario, we have the exact same configuration of buildings and the exact same potential load of 1515 watts of potential power. However, because in this case we're using the conductive wire has a potential load capacity of 2000 watts, which means one set of wiring can handle your entire network. You do not have to build a separate feed and splice the segment in order to have your base running at full capacity. Likewise, in this scenario, we're going to need a third coal generator, and we're going to connect this to our existing power network. Okay, so now in this scenario, we could technically just connect the heavy watt conductive wire directly to our regular conductive wire, and this would still power our base just fine. So now we can do without the transformers, right? Well, not quite, because inevitably, this is going to expand even farther as your colony grows. You're going to have so many different things running at the same time that this is only going to make do for a very short period until your power network currently outgrows what you have set up. So there's a couple different methods that we can go about to fix this. First of all, we have to sever this connection, otherwise we're going to have a problem. The first scenario is that you can use the regular power transformer, just like we did above, and place two of them, but this time we're going to connect the outputs together. Since the outputs are connected together and both power transformers produce 1000 watts, we're going to be able to add up those outputs to produce a maximum 2000 watts on our conductive wire. So this is a great way to limit exactly how much power you want to send through this conductive wire. Instead of tapping off in different directions, just connect the outputs together, and you'll have 2000 watts connected to go power all these buildings. The second method is something that I prefer to use, and it just helps your base look a little more tidy, and that's going to be using the large power transformer. The large power transformer does exactly the same thing as the regular power transformer, however, its power output is 4000 watts, or 4 kilowatts. In this scenario, it's still going to work perfectly fine because we're still stepping down from the heavy watt conductive wire, which is eventually going to carry our entire base load, to the conductive wire, which is only going to have 1500 watts of power on it. The major difference in this scenario is that you have to actively be conscious of how much load you're putting on the conductive wire, otherwise it's very easy to overload. I find that the large power transformer looks more aesthetically pleasing placed in your base rather than having 2 regular power transformers. It also takes up slightly less space at 3 tiles instead of 4. But both of these scenarios are going to work just fine, so it really depends on what you prefer. So now that we've done an overview of how power networks work in Oxygen Not Included, let's head into some of the tips that are going to help you make the transition from early game to mid game. My very first tip is going to be limiting your usage of the regular power wire throughout your base, even early on in your colony. In my opinion, it is well worth it to make the rock crusher as early as possible and start building conductive wires wherever you can, as long as your materials allow you to do so. In my playthroughs, as soon as I get my duplicants off the manual generator and I get the cold generator built, I like to set up a rock crusher right away so I can start using that duplicant that was originally on the manual generator and start producing refined copper out of copper ore. This is definitely not the most efficient way to use your copper ore. 100 kilograms of copper ore will transform into only 50 kilograms of refined copper. So you're basically losing 50% of that original copper ore and turning it into sand instead. Now, sand is obviously going to be useful for filtration methods, but later on in your colony, you're going to be able to produce that copper ore at a much better ratio, whether you're using a metal refinery or smooth hatches. Even still, I think this trade-off is very much worth it. This is a base that I started not too long ago. I'm only about 13.5 hours in on cycle 190, and my entire power network has already transformed into conductive wires. The reason I like to use conductive wires everywhere within my base as soon as possible is because this limits how much rebuilding I have to do later on when I get to my mid-game transition phase, and it's also going to allow me to rapidly expand my power network and add different machineries and buildings to it without needing to run more regular wires throughout the base. And it's not uncommon for me with a new playthrough to rebuild my entire power network wiring very early on as soon as I get access to conductive wires. Keep in mind that everything that I'm telling you here assumes that your production of your power is going to be in a centralized location, such as these coal generators. I don't want my duplicants to be running all over the map feeding several different coal generators in various locations, so I find it a lot easier to keep that concentrated into one area so the duplicants can fill it with coal whenever they're in the area and not have to run all over the base. So if you're running the power wires from one single location, you're going to need to use transformers and have multiple different circuits running parallel with each other throughout your base. And tip number 2 is relocating your coal generators and transformers outside of your main living quarters as soon as possible. This is very obvious in the long term, but in the short term it might not seem like much of a priority. If heat was ever your colony's demise, moving your generators outside of your base is going to help a lot in managing your heating and your cooling within your base. In this instance, I used to have my coal generators right here in this tiny little room, and I would block it off, and it would be easy access for my duplicants to be able to feed it with coal to replenish the power requirements. Moving your coal generators outside of your base is going to make heat management a lot easier, as well as your large power transformers. Keep in mind that even a power transformer is going to produce heat. This large power transformer produces 1000 DTUs per second of heat, and the coal generators produce 9k DTUs per second. Even something like the smart battery produces 500 DTUs per second. Everything is producing heat that is using power. So the best thing to do as soon as you're able to do so is to move all this infrastructure outside of your base where it's not going to affect your living quarters, and in the very long term, such as the midway portion of your mid-game phase, you might want to consider putting everything that is producing heat into an industrial brick to either recapture the heat and turn it into power, or to cool it down actively so you don't have a heat problem whatsoever. Also, once you move your coal generators outside of your base, consider putting a storage bin here of some sort, and then of course an auto sweeper, as this is going to allow you to refill the storage bin with coal and let the auto sweeper take care of all the refilling tasks for your coal generators, so your duplicants don't have to come here and do it themselves whenever the coal generators are requesting fuel. Tip number 3, start using heavy watt wiring as early as practical, as long as you have the materials to build them. More specifically, you want to build heavy watt wires on the exterior of your base, as these cannot be hidden inside walls like conductive and regular wiring can be. Having conductive wires exposed inside of your base is going to contribute negatively to your morale. You can see that the negative value for having heavy watt conductive wire visible is -90, so this is very hard to overcome, even by something like carpeted tiles. On the flip side, not only can conductive wiring be hidden inside ceilings, floors, and walls, but it also doesn't contribute negatively to your morale. You can see that I'm hovering over the conductive wires in this case, and there's absolutely no negative impact to having the conductive wire visible. It has a 0 decor rating. Alternatively, if you want to run the heavy watt conductive wire inside of your base, you can do as I did here and have it separated by a carpeted tile above it and an insulated tile below. This keeps your duplicants from being able to come in this area, which means the only time they're going to get a negative decor debuff to their character is when they pass this on the ladder or the fire pole. Also remember that having transformers exposed inside of your base is going to give you a negative decor value. Now, of course, there's not much you can do about decor in the early game, but of course, these are tips for making that transition into your mid game. So be sure to relocate these transformers or put them into an enclosed space like this so your duplicants are not getting the negative decor value, because this is also around the time when you're going to be adding skill points into many of your duplicants, and morale bonuses are going to be very helpful to get your duplicants leveled up to where you want them to be. Tip number 4 is another reason why you should have heavy watt wiring outside of your base. Heavy watt wiring on the outside of your base allows you to connect all of your power sources and all of your major power consumers into one complete network. The network of your entire colony should eventually be on one power grid. Now, there are situations, of course, where you would want more than one power grid. In my case, I have a potential load of 87 kilowatts out of 50 kilowatts on this power network. Of course, I don't ever anticipate reaching that 87 because a lot of these consumers in this base only run periodically. Very few of them are actually going to turn on all at the same time. And you can see this from the current load that is constantly changing in real time on the tooltip. It fluctuates between 5 to 9 kilowatts out of 50 kilowatts for my entire usage. Having your entire power network connected all in one also allows you to use all of your different power sources, whether it's natural gas, petroleum, or hydrogen, and have them all working with one another depending on what sources of power you have available the most. And they should all be on their own smart battery. This is because smart batteries will allow you to toggle the high and low threshold of whatever generators that they're connected to, so less desirable methods like coal generation can be left as backups without the need for your infrastructure to be redesigned. You can see in this case that I have 3 smart batteries and they're all connected to the same power network, but they're all controlling different ways of power production. The smart battery on the far right is controlling the natural gas generators, the smart battery on the left is controlling petroleum generators, and the smart battery on the bottom is controlling the hydrogen generators. And these are all configured with different parameters. Petroleum starts at 40% low threshold, natural gas starts at 80%, and hydrogen starts at 85%. And they all charge to different requirements as well. So this tells the different forms of power generation to kick on first, prioritize power generation of those sources over others. The benefit of this is that you don't constantly have to be providing petroleum to your petroleum generators if you have an infinite source of hydrogen from a vent or an infinite source of natural gas. But you still want your petroleum generators connected to that network in case you have very large spikes in your demand like I was showing you earlier in the tooltip. Tip number 5 is still going to focus on smart batteries. You should only ever have one battery per power source. I see new players make this mistake all the time, where they're using multiple standard batteries or multiple jumbo batteries to store their power. The jumbo batteries have a power leak of 2 kilojoules per cycle, and the standard battery has a power leak of 1000 joules per cycle. Now, this power loss doesn't sound like a lot, but it's not really worth it to have the power loss to begin with, when it's fairly easy to get to the smart batteries using the rock crusher and a little bit of extra time on the research station. The smart battery, for comparison, only has a power leak of 400 joules per cycle, and it also produces way less heat than the jumbo and the standard battery at only 500 DTUs per second, whereas the jumbo battery is going to produce 1.25 kDTUs per second, and the standard battery produces the same. So the more of these batteries that you have hooked up to your power sources, the bigger the leak is going to be, so you might as well switch to smart batteries, which have a fraction of that leak to begin with. And don't forget, you only need one smart battery per power generation method. Your entire colony can run off just one smart battery as long as it's connected to a source that is able to reproduce that power as you're using it. So in my case, the power isn't actually coming from any of these 3 power methods, it's actually coming from my geothermal all the way down at the bottom here. Now, I went a little overboard with this geothermal method. I actually don't even have a smart battery for it because this is a sandbox tutorial that I previously did, and we're creating way too much power here that we're not even using in our base. You can check this geothermal video out, and you can copy these concepts to apply it to your own playthrough, but just remember that you don't need to have a plant this big in order to power your playthrough, and also remember that the bigger your plant is, the faster you're going to deplete the magma that is underneath and turn it into igneous rock. Now, because a base that has a lot of power-demanding infrastructure, such as metal refineries and aqua tuners, does have very high spikes in demand occasionally, you might be thinking to yourself that it would be better off to have more storage for power than just one smart battery. But when you have multiple sources of power set up, like you do in this situation, you actually still have more than one source of power, but they're just spread across different power production methods. Is that you don't need to have 3 smart batteries connected to just your petroleum generators. You can have 3 in total connected to 3 different sources. Your smart batteries will automatically turn on these power generation methods that they're connected to, so as long as you can produce more power than whatever your peak demand is, you should never have to worry about power generation and having too many smart batteries. Also keep in mind that your potential load is not your peak demand. Your potential load is everything connected on the network altogether. But many of these things are not going to always be consuming power, such as your auto sweepers, your conveyor loaders, your micro musher, and so on. Also keep in mind that just because the potential load of 87 kilowatts is way above the maximum allowed 50 kilowatts doesn't necessarily mean that I have to rebuild my power network. This is simply because I have so much stuff on this power network that if everything was running all at the same time, I would theoretically hit that maximum load. But this is simply not possible for many reasons. First of all, I just don't have the duplicate power to run everything that's required to run at the same time in order to hit that limit. I would need to be running my metal refineries, oil refineries, rock crusher, glass forge, all of my aqua tuners within my base, all of my kitchen, and all of my auto sweepers everywhere would have to be working simultaneously, along with all of my Atmos suits charging simultaneously. While it's true that if you have more duplicates, your power requirements will generally be higher because there's more production output from your duplicates, it is still unlikely that you would ever hit the 87 kilowatt mark due to scheduling alone. The things that you really need to be focused on is the real-time current load and making sure that your power generators can supply that load range for you. The next tip that I have is to limit your use of power transformers. You can see that on this base, I don't have very many power transformers, and I only use them occasionally in areas where I don't want to run heavy watt conductive wire throughout my base. Instead, what I prefer to do is have all my power transformers inside of an industrial brick. This industrial brick is cooled, so I don't have to worry about any overheating. So building these out of gold is technically overkill. I could have built them out of copper. And then from here, I branch out to several different areas where the power is needed. This is particularly useful if I want to be sending power in areas that are fully enclosed, and I don't want to be penetrating them using the heavy watt conductive joint plate, which is going to transfer heat or cooling into the surrounding atmospheres. But everywhere else, I'm using heavy watt conductive wire, even inside my steam room. Heavy watt conductive wire also enters my steam room, but I'm using a vacuum seal in order to prevent the heat from the steam room from escaping outside. So if we take a look at the temperature, this joint plate is very hot, and it's connected to the outside joint plate. But because there's a vacuum seal in the middle with a simple liquid lock made out of crude oil, the heat is unable to escape the steam room, which keeps my outside temperatures relatively cool, even though I don't really care what the temperature would be, simply because this is outside of my main base and outside of my duplicate's living quarters. And you can also see that this heavy watt conductive joint plate is actually providing a lot of cooling to the surrounding area because it's connected directly to my cooled industrial brick, and it has no protection at all from the outside atmosphere. So this conductive joint plate gets very cold because of the ambient temperatures in here, and that cooling gets spread throughout my asteroid. So just some things to keep in mind when you're building these chambers. Here's another example of a very cold conductive joint plate and a very warm heavy watt conductive joint plate. This is separated by a vacuum, so I'm not allowing the warm temperatures to come into my cooled industrial brick. That was it for this tutorial on power mechanics and oxygen not included, and how to make the transition from early game to mid game for your power network. I hope that this tutorial allowed you to learn some stuff about the power mechanics that you didn't know before, and if you did, be sure to leave a rating on this video if you've made it this far. It really helps me out in the algorithm. Also, please leave a comment below to let me know if there's any tips that I missed if you're a more experienced player, or if there's something that you have a question about regarding the power networks. Also, feel free to leave any video ideas in the comments below. I love getting your feedback on what topic I should cover next, so don't be afraid to drop your suggestions. And if you'd like to see more videos like this in the future, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Finally, thank you to all the supporters that I've had over the course of the several months. I really appreciate you coming by, supporting the channel, watching the videos, and even showing up on the live streams just to say hello. I have a lot more live streams coming up planned, and I'm currently doing a playthrough, so if you haven't seen those videos, be sure to check them out. So until the next one, I'm Ethan, and I'll see you guys in the next video.